All right, in our last video, we're going to look at the consistent racial disparities in this country, or inequalities, over the history of this country since racism, and really since the 1960s or 70s. And the story we're going to be looking at here is the fact that, on the one hand, things are generally getting better, but on the other hand, the inequalities between different groups tend to be very persistent. And we're going to look at some of these in turn and think about why this might be. What we're looking at here is a chart of GPA, or grade point average, between 1990 and 2000 over a 20-year period. And we see a pretty clear trend. Everybody's going up. That's pretty good. But if you notice, instead of looking at the lines, look at the gap between them. That gap is pretty steady over time. Yeah, it narrows here and there. But in fact, we note that the disparity between whites and blacks, for example, has widened over time, and black and Hispanic folks as well. So while Asians have, as a race, remained on top, though within that racial category there's a lot of differences, the gap between groups tends to remain. We see this pattern in a lot of different places. Unemployment, for example. While the unemployment rises and falls by different cycles of the economy, the gaps between groups remain pretty steady. African Americans still have the highest unemployment rate and are hit a little bit harder by it during the most difficult times. And we see pretty steady differences in things like economic earnings. Again, here Asian Americans tend to be the highest earners, followed by whites, blacks and Hispanics in the lowest categories. And black women and Hispanic women are the worst off, right? So we're looking at the intersection of gender and race. How are these institutional disparities, how do they hold on so much over time, despite the civil rights movement, despite BLM, despite efforts to make them better? One of the key issues we'll find in our society is actually racial segregation, particularly residential segregation. This phenomenon happens in a number of different ways. Historically, we had things called like redlining, which was where certain districts that were deemed to be African American were literally outlined in red and were deemed to be kind of areas banks wouldn't lend to. There's a lot of discrimination in lending, so many subprime loans, which are seen as not good loans, are given to black folks. Payday loans with extremely high interest rates are as well. This is where you pay 200 or 300% interest rate, which is an extraordinary amount. So we see a lot of discrimination in lending. Black folks are much more likely to be denied mortgages, meaning access to wealth, right? Access to a home. One study in Boston showed that black and Latinx folks were 60% more likely to be denied a loan, even with their credit score taken into account or controlled for. But part of what this means is that there's a pretty persistent pattern in segregation. One of these ways we measure this is through what we call exposure indices. It's not going to show you the other slide, that's fine. So this means, like, who are you exposed to by race and ethnic group on a daily basis? Who do you run into? Who do you see? Right, so this first column, we see white folks, and that almost 73%, let's say, of the people they ran into are other white folks. In Atlanta, this is in Atlanta. It's even more stark for black folks. That black folks, almost the entirety of who they see are other black folks. That means that they're very, very segregated. Peachtree City, a more diverse area, we see, again, extraordinary segregation here. When we think about why segregation is important, we have to remember that a lot of funding, a lot of real estate values, and a lot of wealth building is based on where we live. The opportunities we have, the jobs we can get, but also the value of our home depends on where we live. The value of our home also depends on our property, makes our property taxes higher. That means that there's more money for public schooling, which are largely funded by property taxes. So when we want to explain things like why are there less services in black neighborhoods, why are the schools worse? It's because there's less money, because the property taxes are lower, because the real estate value is lower. So persistent segregation, persistent racism in housing markets uh, makes for the continuing cycle of racial inequality.